Last week it was reported that Manchester United and Barcelona had both breached UEFA FFP rules and fined €300,000 and €500,000 respectively, amongst a list of other clubs. Two of the most established European clubs have breached the rules that some say were intended to protect them. The monitoring period that was assessing the break-even calculation included COVID-19, something which decimated the whole of football. And we are talking the old FFP rules under UEFA competitions, which were amended for COVID-19 to take into account the lost revenues of the clubs. If you want to learn more about Barcelona's financial situation and what led to a breach under the UEFA rules, why not click the link above? We've already covered this about 4 weeks ago on our channel. And towards the end of the video, we predicted an issue with UEFA FFP. And that seems like it's now come to light. But what about Manchester United, the most recognisable football brand in English football, if not Europe or even the world? Manchester United have reportedly recorded minor break-even deficits under the UEFA break-even rules. They've acknowledged and accepted the breach, which is the opposite to that of Barcelona, who say they will fight all the way to CAS if needed. And Manchester United have acknowledged this rule breach as a technical breach under the COVID umbrella and the way that UEFA have interpreted the rules for COVID losses. But is COVID the only reason why Manchester United have breached the rules? How could a club of Manchester United's stature be in breach of a set of rules that others have not yet breached? Leading the way historically when it comes to record-breaking revenues, being profitable for a large part of the last decade. So how is it now possible that Manchester United are breaching FFP rules? Is this anything to do with the way that the Glazers run and operate the club? Why have no bans been served by UEFA? And does it mean that United will be restricted in the summer transfer window and beyond when it comes to UEFA's FFP? Without an understanding of the FFP rules before COVID and how they've been amended since, it's quite difficult to unpick an FFP calculation. But if you want to stick around for the rest of the video, we're about to shed some light on it for you. My name's Neil Wood and I'm a football finance professional. This channel, Football Finance Professionals, is dedicated to teaching you about finance through the medium of football. So whether you want to learn about football finance specifically, or you have a desire to learn about finance through a subject that you love, we believe football can bring finance to life. And we're here to teach you about that topic. We're not here to judge what clubs do, but we're here to try to educate you. So if you like the video, you want to see more, hit like, share with your friends and subscribe to support the channel. Manchester United, an English football behemoth, one of the most recognisable brands in the world, has breached FFP and has acknowledged so. Historically, it's been top of the league when it comes to generating revenue and has even generated £150 million of pre-tax profits in the decade to 2020. Since COVID, Manchester United has posted pre-tax losses, but that's largely due to the pandemic, with the exception of the previous year. But Manchester United has always been run like a business first, rather than a football club. And sometimes the two have gone hand in hand. Under Sir Alex Ferguson and that era, they were almost complementary. Profits on player sales would generate finances that could be reinvested to purchase players or even into the academies, and those players would go through the academy system into the first team and generate further profits for a financially successful and on-pitch successful club. But nowadays, the club's been suffering from a lack of investment and poor on-pitch performance. And COVID-19 hasn't helped matters, but neither has the way that the Glazers have opted to run the club. The club is laden with $650 million worth of debt, and the Glazers choose to extract value through dividends on an annual basis. Two factors there that have clearly contributed to this FFP breach, and if you want to learn why, make sure you stick around to the end of the video. The Glazers' way of operating and running Manchester United has come under scrutiny from fans, journalists, pundits and many others. But is there anything wrong with the way that the club's been run? Well, surely a self-sustaining, spend what you earn, profit-making club that's paid dividends to its shareholders with no equity going into the club means that we have a club that's self-sustaining and reliant on nobody. So if the Glazers were to turn around and walk away, the club could theoretically continue to operate. And that's the model that UEFA hopes to promote. But this certainly isn't the approach that the fans would like. Most fans would prefer someone who's willing to invest in the club to own their club. They want a club that wins football games, that attracts talent, and one that's owned by owners that are willing to invest in players both through transfer fees, wages, image rights, and even agent fees. But unfortunately for Manchester United fans, the Glazers are not one of those owners. But despite that, Manchester United has been able to turn a profit and pay dividends to its shareholders, holding its own financially. But that's in the context of others being able to invest in line with the rules and almost encouraged to do so by UEFA and Premier League FFP rules, and having wealthy owners that back them, that mean that they can go beyond the initial limits of financial fair play, assuming that they're backed by equity. So at this point, we now have a Manchester United club that requires significant investment versus other clubs in the Premier League in particular that have been investing for years. But what are the FFP rules? Without any investment from shareholders under UEFA rules, clubs are allowed to lose €5 million over a 3-year period, and that assumes no equity injections whatsoever, so definitely applicable when it comes to Manchester United. There are some key differences when it comes to UEFA and Premier League rules, but they do encourage spend in similar areas, most notably infrastructure. Both sets of rules encourage clubs to invest in academies and stadia, something that United have failed to do under the Glazers, whereas others have done so. Tottenham, Arsenal, Manchester City, even Liverpool and Everton have either done so or committed to investing in their stadia. If backed by equity injections under UEFA rules, clubs are allowed to lose €30 million, talking about the old FFP rules, and under Premier League guidelines, they're allowed to lose €105 million. If the difference between the €5 million and €30 million under UEFA, or £15 million and £105 million, is backed by equity injections or secure funding from the shareholders. And again, that's over a 3-year monitoring period. But Manchester United haven't issued shares since the 80s. What? Surely that's not right. They issue shares all the time, they're listed. Well, actually, it's the football club that matters under UEFA rules. The football club is part of the wider group when it comes to Manchester United PLC. But it's the licensee being the football club that UEFA is looking to protect. UEFA doesn't necessarily care about everything that sits around the football club. Many clubs have complicated group structures which could fall away under new ownership, but that club will remain. So what United need to be able to do in future or now is issue shares from the legal entity Manchester United Football Club Limited, not Manchester United PLC. So they've issued no equity when it comes to UEFA assessing their losses. And this means that they're operating at the lower loss limits of €5 million over a 3-year period. But why has this led to a breach of FFP rules? Well, first of all, your starting point when you're looking at calculating FFP calculations is looking at the profit or loss before tax. And that would be over a 4-year period. Why 4 years if we're looking at 3 years of a monitoring period? Well, we're looking back over a period that's been impacted by COVID. And if you recall, in March 2020, gains were curtailed and the season bled into the next financial year. So the authorities decided to stitch 2 seasons together, or 2 financial years together, and call it one reporting period. So from 2019 to the end of 2021, that's effectively 1 year. If we rewind back a year, back to the 2021 assessment, ignoring the latest full year of financial results from Manchester United's perspective, looking at Manchester United PLC's group accounts, from 2018 to the end of 2021, Manchester United lost a cumulative £17 million before tax. So surely that means that they breached a year ago. Well, it doesn't, because we've got some reliefs that we were talking about earlier, being infrastructure, community development, youth development, and women's costs, plus a bunch of others that we won't go into. And based on our calculations, on average, United will be able to relieve approximately £30 million against their FFP calculations each season. So over a 4-year period, that equates to £120 million, meaning that they'd effectively make a surplus when it comes to break even. And if we were rewinding a year, we would have to add in the 17-18 pre-tax profit, which was £26 million. So at that point, United would have had headroom in their FFP break-even calculation of approximately £130 million. Well, that's not quite the case. Why not? Well, it's not the end of the story, because of the dividends that we mentioned earlier. But surely they're not expenses, so why would they matter? For anybody who knows anything about finance, dividends are distributions from equity, and therefore aren't accounted for as expenses. But not under UEFA guidelines. Dividends count as what's called relevant expenses, and the UEFA break-even calculation takes into account relevant income less relevant expenses to get to your break-even calculation. The starting point is often pre-tax profit or loss, with adjustments made thereafter. But dividends definitely come off that calculation. Over the period that we're looking at, which was a 4-year period from 2021 backwards, the Glazers took out £80 million of dividends, which means that they're left with £50 million of headroom, therefore no breach in the previous financial year. £50 million of headroom is a healthy figure. But if we fast forward 12 months, through the 21-22 season, Manchester United posted pre-tax losses of nearly £150 million. This is despite revenues bouncing back almost to pre-COVID levels of £583 million, but we also had record operating costs and exceptional items recorded in the profit and loss account of Manchester United in 21-22. These costs came to £692 million, including wages of £384 million and £151 million of player registration amortisation. There was also a £25 million exceptional item relating to the release of Ole Solskjaer, the previous manager, and his team. In addition to the operating costs, finance costs went through the roof, and that's because of the US denominated debt put in place by the Glazers. Denominated in US dollars, but being reported in sterling means that there's an FX exposure there, and the Glazers have opted to leave it as an unhedged exposure. Well, for those that don't know, after all, we're here to educate you. Monetary items on the balance sheet that are unhedged are remeasured at the spot rate at the end of each financial year, comparing that to the previous financial year. And sterling or GBP weakened against the dollar in that time frame. At the start of the financial year, 1 GBP was worth 1.4 US dollars. At the end of the financial year, 1 GBP was only worth 1.2 US dollars, which means that the $650 million debt, which was previously measured at 1.4, would be remeasured at 1.2 and therefore getting greater in size. The liability was bigger in sterling, and the difference being recorded in the profit and loss account as an FX loss. And this contributed to an overall loss before tax of £150 million for Manchester United in the year ended 2022. This again was compounded by the Glazers, who decided to take a £33 million dividend, increasing that loss in the eyes of UEFA to a starting point of £183 million before anything else has been adjusted. With FFP, once again, we have those £30 million per season, approximately, and we'll never know the exact figure, over a 4-year period, equating to £120 million that we can offset against the cumulative losses over a 4-year period, which would now stand at £258 million. A ridiculous figure for Manchester United, for a club that's supposed to be successful financially as its primary objective. That's not the end of the story. At this point, we can add back that £30 million per season, which equates to £120 million. So we're talking about a deficit only of £130 million. But that's well in excess of the €5 million that's set by UEFA over a 3-year period. But again, we're talking about a COVID-impacted period with 2 years of COVID relief that's still to come on that £130 million deficit. And with games being played behind closed doors and Manchester United's matchday revenue being the highest in the league, that's where they've really suffered. Who knows what would have happened to broadcasting income if games were played with fans? It's not something that we can go back and replay or predict. But Manchester United and Old Trafford is often seen as a fortress, with the crowd being known as a 12th man. So perhaps they would have done even better on the pitch, finishing higher in the Premier League or going further in European competitions. This is where the minor technical hitch comes in. What UEFA said to all clubs during COVID-19 is that any lost revenues in comparison to 2019 as the base year, which wasn't impacted by COVID, could be adjusted. And any further increases that were justified through new contracts, let's say a new sponsorship agreement, could also be adjusted if those amounts weren't recorded in the P&L. Now, this would only be for the break-even calculation during those COVID impacted years. And for UEFA, that was 2 years, 1920 and 2021. United state that they lost €281 million over COVID impacted years, but they were only able to recognise €15 million of that in the FFP calculation due to a change in how UEFA have interpreted their rules. Clearly, if €281 million was able to be recognised, the €130 million deficit would be consumed and there would be no compliance issue. UEFA did issue COVID-related guidance and an addendum to the rules, and that's published on the UEFA website. And we quote, "Anticipated average revenues for the reporting periods ending 2020 and 2021 are as a minimum equivalent to the revenues as listed below, relevant for the calculation of the break-even result, recognised in the reporting period ending 2019. This 2019 base can be increased if supported by legal or contractual arrangements, as long as that was concluded before COVID-19. So why weren't United allowed to recognise €281 million of COVID-related losses in their FFP calculation? Well, first of all, as we know, it wasn't an issue last year in the 2021 reporting period. It's only been an issue when we've included the 21-22 financial results with that huge loss, which was driven by what we've already discussed: player wages, amortisation, one-off costs, and the US dollar moving against the sterling. On top of that, the £33 million worth of dividends. That's the year when United really needed the help from COVID. Well, according to our calculations, if we look at 2019-20 and 2021, we can calculate an approximate £12 million worth of a deficit before any COVID reliefs. That equates to approximately €15 million. That's taking into account all of the pre-tax losses and profits, all of the dividends, and all of the standard reliefs, ignoring anything for COVID. So that means for the 2 COVID impacted years, United were in deficit by £12 million, approximately €15 million. And UEFA decided that they could only go up to break even. They couldn't go beyond break even and re-establish what would have happened if COVID hadn't have hit, which limits the amount that they could add back just to reach the point of break even in those years specifically. What UEFA said was you cannot recompensate for the lost revenues beyond break even and effectively add those to future loss-making periods. And that's what's happened with United. United have now come out of the other end of COVID, revenues have recovered, as they have across the majority of clubs, but costs have gone through the roof. And the breach in 21-22 isn't to do with COVID. It's to do with the factors that we've already discussed. But if COVID hadn't happened, revenues would have been at a point that would mean that United wouldn't have breached the rules. So that's where we can get to the point where we have a technicality, an issue where the way that the rules have been written, and they haven't changed, it's just that the way that UEFA have interpreted those rules, is that you cannot go beyond break even in those COVID impacted years and effectively readjust for future periods which would come under that monitoring period. All somewhat of a mess, if you ask me. And that's the reason why UEFA have decided to draw a line under all those COVID impacted years and start afresh in 22-23. But with all that taken into account, Manchester United are likely to have breached the rules by approximately £125 million, taking into account the €15 million of relief, the losses that have been incurred in 2022, including the dividends paid out to the Glazers. Now, is that a minor breach, or is it that they were talking about a minor breach on a technicality? To be honest, I do have sympathy with the club. If COVID hadn't have happened, then United will have almost guaranteed to have filled Old Trafford week in, week out, and matchday revenues would have been 100 million. In 2021, matchday revenues were 8. So instantly, you can say they've lost out significantly. And it's not their fault. So yes, they've breached the rules, and they've breached them in what's been described as a minor way, but some fans might argue that it's more than minor, because the quantum of the breach is substantial at what we estimate to be approximately 125 million. But in response, United have been punished with a fine, as have Barcelona and others. No bans have been administered, and that's because UEFA do not want clubs to suffer more than they need to as a result of COVID-impacted years. So they've taken a softened approach to the regulation throughout these years, and it's been consistent across Europe. UEFA really do not want to punish clubs as a result of a global pandemic. and rightly so in our opinion. So in summary, what's caused the breach for Manchester United? Well, first of all, you have to say it's largely attributed to COVID-19. But could the breach have been mitigated by the owners or the management team of the club? Well, the answer to that has to be yes. If the Glazers hadn't taken out £90 million of dividends over that period, which is something that really does get under the skin of the fans, or if they'd taken a different approach to risk management when it comes to managing the financial risk, particularly with the FX and the US dollar debt, or even better, if they hadn't saddled the club with debt at all, that would be a dream come true for the fans. Either of those options, risk management when it comes to managing the US dollar risk or removing the debt, will be music to the fans' ears. But given that they've only received a fine of €300,000, it's just like 1 week's wages for one of their star players. So potentially not that big a deal. But could this impact future transfer windows, including the one that's now open, or even thereafter? Well, as we've mentioned, UEFA's perspective is wiping the slate clean from the start of 22-23. So the 257 million starting point of pre-tax losses, including dividends, is being removed from the UEFA FFP calculation. We start afresh from 22-23. And in that time, sterling has strengthened against the US dollar. So instead of an FX loss, we're going to get an FX gain in the profit and loss account of Manchester United. But the club is also up for sale. The Glazers haven't paid dividends this year. This video may go some way to explain why that hasn't happened. But again, since the rules have changed, there's no need to worry from a UEFA financial sustainability regulations compliance perspective when it comes to United fans. But what about the Premier League? We think that's probably a topic for another video. The rules are different, and the biggest difference being the continuation of the Premier League rules. They haven't stopped and restarted like the UEFA rules have. Not yet, at least. But that's a topic for another time. For now, we'll say goodbye. We hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please hit like. Subscribe for more football finance content. My name's Neil Wood, and I'm a football finance professional. Thanks for watching.